Okay, so get ready to go deep on this one, folks, because today we're tackling whether adults should or shouldn't hide their breakdowns. Like, do we just power through, or is it healthier to let it all out? And how does that work in the age of everyone filming everything? We got a source that goes deep into both sides of this, so buckle up.
You know, it's funny. The source kind of starts right off by pointing out something pretty obvious when you think about it. Like, if you're having a full-blown breakdown, like truly coming undone, hiding it might be a little tough, don't you think?
Oh yeah, it's like our bodies have a way of snitching on us even when our minds are trying to play it cool, huh?
Precisely. It's like, sorry, brain, I know you're trying to maintain composure in this meeting, but I'm going to go ahead and break out in a cold sweat.
Or the classic shaky voice. Everyone's seen it. Maybe even been there.
Exactly. And it's interesting, right? Because the source isn't trying to shame anyone for, being human. It's more like, let's acknowledge our bodies and minds sometimes react in ways we don't consciously choose.
Even if it happens at the worst possible time, like, oh no, not during my big presentation.
Right. But here's where the source got really interesting for me. They brought up this idea of a controlled breakdown, which sounds kind of impossible, right?
Yeah, like a contradiction in terms, almost. But I think I get where they're going with it.
It's not about completely preventing the breakdown, but maybe having some say in how it happens,
Okay, so less about if it happens, more about when and where. So how do we control that?
This is where that whole idea of compartmentalization comes in and whether it's actually healthy or not. You familiar with that term?
Yeah, I've heard it, but honestly, not totally sure I get it.
Think of it like this. We can't always control when those big emotions hit us, right?
Oh, tell me about it.
But maybe, just maybe, we can decide how and where we express them. The example they used, which I thought was really smart, was a single parent.
Right. I remember that one. They were talking about how that parent might hold it together for their kids' sake, but then later on.
Exactly. They have that breakdown, let it all out, but to a close friend or someone they trust.
It makes you wonder, is that actually healthier than just trying to be strong and bottling it all up all the time?
That's the big question, isn't it? Because maybe sometimes it's not about denying our emotions, but more like being strategic about them.
Ooh, I like that strategic. Especially if, like the example, other people are involved.
It really highlights how crucial context can be. We have instincts to protect not just ourselves, but those we love. So maybe strength isn't always about this stoic, never break facade.
It's more nuanced, right? Like knowing when to hold them, when to fold them, as they say.
Huh. I love that. But speaking of nuance, the article then flips it and asks if hiding our struggles is really that great, especially now.
Oh yeah, and this whole vulnerability is strength world we're living in. That's a good point.
Right. It's like, are we sending mixed messages? Because on one hand, there has been a big shift toward being more open about mental health, which is awesome.
Totally. Even just anecdotally, it feels way more acceptable to say, hey, I'm struggling, without everyone assuming you're going to, fall apart completely.
Exactly. And honestly, I think that's a really positive change, wouldn't you say?
100%.
Yeah.
But what's driving that shift? I mean, is it all good?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Part of it is definitely more awareness. People are actually being educated about mental health, which is huge. But social media, for all its flaws, you got to admit, it's played a role too, right?
For sure, for better or worse. But
Yeah.
like anything, there are downsides. Like, what about oversharing?
Exactly. Or that whole performative vulnerability thing where it's less about genuine connection and more about seeking attention online.
Which I'm sure we'll get into, because that whole dynamic probably deserves its own deep dive. But
Yeah.
this whole idea of people being more open, it reminded me of that example in the source, the one about that person who had kind of a breakdown at a party.
Oh, right. That was a powerful one. Instead of it being this big dramatic scene, like you might expect.
Everyone totally rallied around them. It was actually really heartwarming.
Which just goes to show sometimes being vulnerable can create these incredible moments of human connection, huh?
Totally. And it made me think, like, that's what we're kind of all craving deep down, right? Especially when we're struggling, to feel seen and understood and supported.
Without a doubt. That need for connection, it's primal,
Totally. But here's where I think things get really interesting in the digital age. Because now, on top of everything else, there's this fear that a breakdown won't just be a personal experience, but a public spectacle.
Ooh, yeah, that's the double-edged sword of our hyper-connected world, for sure. We've got more support than ever, potentially, but also
More ways for things to go very, very wrong.
Exactly. It's a minefield of ethical questions about privacy, consent, you name it. Just because someone's having a hard time doesn't mean they deserve to have that moment plastered all over the internet, right?
Totally. It's like, where do we draw the line? And that example from the source about the executive who chooses to save their breakdown for the privacy of their own home because they're terrified of a public meltdown going viral, that really got to me.
Yeah, it speaks to how much pressure people feel, especially those in high visibility positions, to always be on, as though being vulnerable is somehow a weakness, which is, well,
A little outdated, to say the least, but again, probably a topic for another deep dive. So where does our source land on all of this?
well, the interesting thing is they don't really pick a side. It's more like they highlight how complicated it all is, especially now with the whole digital layer added in.
Right, right. It's not like a simple should or shouldn't kind of thing.
Exactly. They make this point that we should have the right to fall apart. Like, it's human. But at the same
I'm
time,
going to be smart about it, right?
right, be mindful of the when, the where, the who, because our actions have ripple effects, especially online.
It's like that saying, with great power comes great responsibility.
100%. We've got the power to be vulnerable, to share our struggles, but also the responsibility to do it in a way that protects ourselves and others.
Oof, that's deep. It's like food for thought for all of us, really. Makes you think about all the other rights we have that come with these unspoken responsibilities attached, you know?
It's a really interesting parallel, like freedom of speech, super important, obviously, but it comes with the responsibility to use your voice thoughtfully.
Exactly. It's not just about saying whatever you want, however you want. Consequences be damned. There's a balance to be struck.
And finding that balance, that's the ongoing challenge, isn't it?
And I love that this deep dive isn't about giving us easy answers, but encouraging us to actually think critically about this stuff and how it plays out in our own lives.
Couldn't agree more. It's so easy to get caught up in what we should do, what we shouldn't feel. But at the end of the day, we're all just human, right? Flawed, messy, wonderful humans just trying to figure things out.
Totally. And sometimes figuring it out means falling apart a little or a lot.
Yeah, exactly. And how we deal with those moments, both individually and as a society, well, that's what really matters.
It's about building a world where it's okay to not be okay, which is easy to say, but actually doing it. That's the tricky part.
No doubt. It takes conscious effort. It starts with asking ourselves, how would I want to be treated if I were the one struggling?
Wow, that's a really good question to ask ourselves. Because chances are none of us want to be judged or shamed for having a hard time. We want support.
Exactly. Kindness, empathy, a listening ear. Those are the things that make a difference. And that's what I hope our listeners take away from this conversation.
Me too. It's about shifting the narrative from, should I hide this, to how can we navigate this together?
Beautifully put. Because ultimately, that's what it's all about, right? We're all in this human experience together, and showing up for each other, especially in those raw, vulnerable moments, that's what truly matters.
Couldn't agree more. And on that note, to everyone listening, a huge thank you for joining us on this deep dive into such a complex and important topic. Remember, it's okay to not be okay.
It's like we're hardwired to seek that out, especially when we're feeling raw.
For sure. But then the source goes on to talk about how the whole digital age adds this whole other layer to things.
Oh, yeah, that's huge.
Because it's one thing to, have a moment with your close friends or even strangers at a party who are showing you support. But then it's a whole other thing if that moment's being recorded and could end up online for the whole world to see.
It's like the vulnerability Olympics out there sometimes, isn't it? Like, who can be the most open, the most raw? And it makes you wonder how much of it is truly authentic versus,
Totally. Is it really vulnerability if you're performing it for likes and shares?
Exactly. And that's where things get ethically murky.
Big time. Because on one hand, we've got this push for more transparency, more authenticity online. But then the flip side is that can easily tip over into exploitation, especially when someone's going through something really tough.
Yeah. Right. It's like just because someone's having a public meltdown doesn't mean we should all grab our phones and hit record. There's a responsibility there to recognize that everyone deserves a certain level of dignity and respect, even in their darkest moments,
100%. And I think that's what makes that example from the source so powerful. The one about the executive who's terrified of having a breakdown at work because they know it'll be all over social media in seconds.
Oh, yeah, I remember that one. It really highlights how different things are now for people in those high visibility positions.
Right. It's like they can't even afford to be human,
Which is a shame because it perpetuates this idea that vulnerability and leadership are somehow incompatible, which is just
so not true. But again, that's probably a whole other deep dive waiting to happen. So with all of that said, where does our source ultimately land on this whole hide it or don't hide it debate?
Well, I think the beauty of this particular piece is they don't try to offer any easy answers, which I appreciate. They basically say, yeah, context is key. Like, ideally, we'd live in a world where we could all just be our authentic selves all the time, breakdowns and all. But we also have to be mindful of the fact that we live in a world where not everyone's going to respond to that with empathy and understanding, sadly.
Yeah, and that's the tough part, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like, how do you balance that need for authenticity with also protecting yourself?
Exactly. And that's where things get really nuanced and personal, I think. There's no one-size-fits-all answer, unfortunately.
Total. But I guess that's why we have these conversations, right? To kind of hash it out and hopefully walk away with more self-awareness and maybe even a little more compassion for ourselves and each other.
I love that. It's less about finding the right answer and more about just creating that space for thoughtful reflection and dialogue.
Absolutely. And on that note, let's take a quick break. But when we come back, we'll continue this deep dive with some final thoughts and takeaways for our listeners. It's like, how do we want to show up in those moments as judges or as fellow travelers on this crazy road of life?
Man, that's a good way to put it, because we're all going to hit those bumps, you know? The question is, how do we treat each other when they do?
And how do we treat ourselves?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's easy to extend compassion to others, but when it's our own breakdown, our own moment of weakness.
Yeah, that's when those negative self-talk tapes start playing, right?
100%. The shoulda, woulda, couldas. Yeah. But I think that's where this whole conversation comes full circle, you know?
Oh, totally. Because if we're really going to create a world where it's okay to not be okay, it has to start with us, with how we treat ourselves when we're struggling.
So true. And maybe, just maybe, if we can start being a little kinder to ourselves, a little more forgiving.
Then we can extend that same grace to others, you know?
Exactly. It's like that whole hurt people thing. But the flip side is also true, right?
100% healed people heal people.
Woof, that's good.
Yeah.
I never write that one down.
Huh. Go for it. But yeah, it all comes back to that self-compassion piece, doesn't it? Because when we can be there for ourselves, even in those messy moments, it allows us to show up more fully for the people around us, too.
And isn't that what it's all about? Connection, support, reminding each other that we're not alone in this crazy thing called life.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
On that note, to everyone listening, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into, let's be honest, a pretty heavy topic.
Yeah.
But hey, sometimes you got to lean into the tough stuff, right? And we hope you walk away from this conversation with some new insights, some food for thought, and maybe even a little more self-compassion in your back pocket.
And hey, if you're out there struggling, please know that you're not alone. There are resources, there's support, and it really is okay to reach out for help.
Absolutely. Take care of yourselves and each other, and we'll catch you on our next deep dive.